My father was bedridden, fading away under my mother's devoted care, until the screen lit up at 3:00 a.m. His text was a terrifying command. I packed his wheelchair and fled into the night, unaware that escaping the house was only the beginning of the hunt. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence of the house at 3 in the morning has a specific weight to it. It is heavy, oppressive, and in my parents' home, it smelled faintly of lavender air freshener masking the sharper, metallic scent of illness. I was lying in the guest room, the same room I had slept in as a teenager, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since I arrived 3 weeks ago. My father, Thomas, was dying. That was the narrative we had been given. It was a rapid, unexplained decline, muscle weakness, confusion, periods of deep, comatose sleep. The doctors were baffled, muttering about autoimmune responses and rare neurological conditions, but my mother, Evelyn, had been a rock. She had taken charge, coordinating the specialists, managing the medications, and insisting that he remain at home where she could care for him personally. I rolled over, checking my phone for the 100th time, the blue light stinging my tired eyes. 2:59 a.m. I was an archivist by trade. My life was built on order, on preserving the past, on making sure that nothing was ever truly lost. But here, in this house, I felt like I was losing everything. I felt helpless. Then, at exactly 3:00 a.m., the phone buzzed against the nightstand. The vibration sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I frowned. Who would be texting me now? I picked it up, my heart doing a strange, anxious flutter in my chest. The name on the screen made no sense. Dad. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. Dad couldn't text. Dad hadn't held a phone in 10 days. His hands were too tremulous, his mind too fogged by the heavy sedatives the specialist had prescribed. I assumed it was a mistake, or maybe Mom had his phone. I swiped the message open. Don't trust Mom. I didn't take the pills tonight. She's talking to him. Come get me. Quiet. The air left my lungs. The world tilted on its axis. I read the words again, parsing them like a historical document that contradicted everything I knew to be true. Don't trust Mom. My mother, the woman who had been pureeing his food, the woman who sat by his bedside reading to him for hours. But the specific detail, I didn't take the pills tonight, sent a chill racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It implied agency. It implied that his fog was chemically induced, not biological. I didn't think, I didn't plan. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. I threw off the covers, not bothering to change out of my oversized t-shirt and sweatpants. I shoved my feet into my sneakers, not tying the laces. I opened the guest room door. The hallway was a cavern of shadows. My parents' room was at the end of the hall, but Dad had been moved to the downstairs study, converted into a makeshift hospital room because he couldn't manage the stairs. I crept down the staircase, skipping the third step that always creaked. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure the sound would wake her. Mom slept upstairs, in the master suite. I reached the study door. It was cracked open. I pushed it gently. Dad was sitting up in the hospital bed she had rented. He looked ghostly pale, his silver hair matted to his forehead, but his eyes, usually glassy and vacant, were wide and terrified. He was trembling. "Clara," he whispered, the sound barely a breath. "Dad," I hissed, rushing to his side. "What is going on?" "No time," he rasped, his hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His skin was clammy. "She's awake. She's on the phone in the kitchen. She thinks I'm out cold. We have to go." "The kitchen," I froze. The kitchen was between us and the garage. "The patio door," he said. "The ramp." I nodded, my mind racing. I grabbed his wheelchair from the corner. It was heavy, cumbersome. I brought it to the bedside. "Can you move?" "Help me." I wrapped my arms around his frail torso. He had lost so much weight in a month. He felt like a bird, hollow bones and paper skin. I hoisted him up, his legs dragging uselessly, and pivoted him into the chair. He groaned, a low sound of pain that he quickly stifled by biting his lip. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Move," he commanded softly. I pushed him toward the sliding glass doors that led to the back patio. I undid the lock with trembling fingers. Click. It sounded like a thunderclap. I paused, holding my breath, straining my ears for the soundo. Footsteps on the hardwood floors. Nothing, just the distant murmur of a voice, my mother's voice. But it didn't sound like the soothing tone she used with the doctors. It was sharp, agitated. I slid the door open, the rush of humid night air hitting us. I pushed him out, the wheels bumping over the threshold. We navigated the darkness of the backyard, moving toward the side gate that led to the driveway. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a pursuit. I felt like a criminal in my own childhood home. I got him to the passenger side of my sedan. Getting him in was a nightmare. He had no core strength. I had to lift his legs, buckle him in, and recline the seat, all while expecting the floodlights to snap on and a scream to tear through the night. I abandoned the wheelchair in the bushes. I didn't have time to collapse it. I jumped into the driver's seat and keyed the ignition. The engine roared to life. As I threw the car into reverse, the kitchen light flickered. The blinds parted. I saw a silhouette, my mother, staring out into the driveway, phone pressed to her ear. I didn't wait to see her reaction. I slammed on the gas, tires screeching on the asphalt, and sped away from the only home I had ever known. As I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, my father let out a sob that broke me in two. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. I drove like a maniac, blowing through 2 stop signs and taking turns fast enough to make the tires squeal. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, locking into a cramp. We were on the interstate, heading north, away from the suburbs and into the empty darkness of the countryside. The rain started then, a slow drizzle that quickly turned into a deluge, the wipers slapping frantically against the glass, matching the chaotic rhythm of my heart. "Dad," I said finally, my voice shaking, "you have to tell me, what is happening? You said she's talking to him. Who is him?" Dad was slumped in the passenger seat, his head lolling against the window. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the escape fading, leaving behind a frail, sick old man. "Julian," he whispered. "Julian," I glanced at him. "The financial guy, the consultant she brought in for the estate planning." "He's not a consultant," Dad wheezed. They are together." My stomach turned over. Together, like having an affair. "Worse," Dad said, closing his eyes. "They're liquidating it, Clara. Everything. The business, the properties, your trust. They think I'm too far gone to notice. They sign papers in front of me. They laugh about it." I felt bile rise in my throat. My mother. The woman who wore pearls to breakfast. The woman who chaired the charity guild. The woman who had cried softly into her handkerchief when the doctor told us Dad might not make it to Christmas. "She's been poisoning me," he said, the words falling like stones. "Not to kill me, just to keep me pliable, confused, so I can't object when she guides my hand to sign the transfers." "Oh my God," I swerved slightly, correcting the car. "We're going to the police, right now." "No," Dad's eyes snapped open. "No police, not yet." "Why not? Dad, this is attempted murder. This is fraud." "She has leverage," he said, his voice trembling. "She told me if I ever tried to tell you, she'd frame me for the warehouse fire, years ago." "The warehouse fire was an electrical fault," I said, confused. "Everyone knows that." "She falsified the report," he murmured, his energy fading rapidly. "She has documents, planted evidence. She's been planning this for years, Clara. If we go to the police without proof of what she's doing, she'll turn it around. She'll say I'm demented, paranoid, and she'll release the evidence to the insurance company. I'll die in prison." My phone, sitting in the cup holder, lit up. Mom calling. I stared at the screen. It rang and rang, then it stopped. Ding, a text message. Clara, is your father with you? I woke up and he's gone. Please, he needs his medication. He's confused and dangerous. Bring him back immediately. She's good, I muttered, reading the preview. She's setting the narrative already. Confused and dangerous. Don't answer, Dad begged. I won't. I pulled off the Highway 3 exits later. We needed a place to hide, somewhere off the grid. I found a Motel 6 nestled behind a truck stop. It was greasy, dimly lit, and perfect. I checked us in using cash I had in my emergency kit in the trunk. I helped Dad into the room. It smelled of stale cigarettes and bleach, and laid him on the bed. He passed out almost immediately, the exertion having drained the last of his reserves. I sat in the cheap plastic chair by the window, watching the rain hammer the parking lot. I opened my laptop. I had grabbed my backpack in the rush, force of habit. Inside was my laptop, my external hard drives, and my work diary. I thought about what Dad said. She's been planning this for years. My mother was meticulous. She was the kind of woman who kept receipts for coffee from 1998, just in case. If she was dismantling my father's life, she would have a paper trail. She would think she was safe because she controlled the physical files in the study. She would think she was safe because Dad was sedated and I was just the bookworm daughter who curated museum exhibits. I opened a terminal window on my laptop and connected to the motel's spotty Wi-Fi. I wasn't a hacker, but I was an archivist. I knew how to find things that people thought were deleted. I knew how to trace metadata. And I knew the passwords to my father's cloud backups my mother didn't even know existed because I had set them up for him 2 years ago when his hard drive crashed. I cracked my knuckles, the fear slowly hardening into cold, sharp anger. She thought she had scrubbed the digital footprint clean, but she had forgotten one crucial thing. I uncover lost histories for a living, and I was about to excavate hers. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, you have to understand who Thomas and Evelyn were to the world. They were the golden couple of our mid-sized city. Dad was the heart. He ran a logistics company that he had built from a single truck into a regional empire. He was the guy who knew every employee's birthday, the guy who paid for his secretary's kids' braces. He was soft, sometimes to a fault. Mom was the spine. She was the structure. She managed the social calendar, the investments, the house, and the image. Growing up, I idolized her elegance. I wanted to be just like her, poised, unbreakable. I didn't realize until I was much older that her poise was actually a terrifying need for control, and her structure was a cage she built around us. I had spent my adult life distancing myself from that cage. I moved 3 states away to work in the archives of the State History Museum. I spent my days with white gloves and magnifying glasses deciphering handwriting from the 1800s. It was quiet, honest work. It was about truth. When Dad got sick, I dropped everything. I took a leave of absence. I came home to be the good daughter. And what did I find? I found Julian. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the uncomfortable motel chair, recalling the first time I met him. It was 2 weeks ago. Mom had introduced him over dinner. "This is Julian Blackwood," she had said, her hand resting a little too comfortably on his forearm. "He's helping us restructure the assets to ensure your father's care is covered in the long term." Julian was a man who looked like he had been generated by an AI instructed to create trustworthy businessman. He was handsome in a generic, polished way, perfect teeth, expensive suit, manicured fingernails. He claimed to be a wealth management consultant with a specialization in crisis transition. I had disliked him instantly. It wasn't just the way he looked at the expensive art on our walls with the appraising eye of an auctioneer. It was the way he spoke to my mother. He spoke to her like they were co-conspirators sharing an inside joke. "Clara," he had said, smiling with too many teeth, "your mother tells me you work in a library. That's quaint." "Archives," I had corrected. "I preserve legal and historical documents." Right, he had waved a hand dismissively. Dusty papers. We're dealing with the future here, Clara. The markets are volatile. We need to be aggressive to protect your father's legacy. I had let it go. I was tired. I was worried about Dad. I trusted Mom's judgment. Now, sitting in this motel room, the pieces clicked together with a sickening precision. Julian wasn't a consultant. He was a shark, and he had smelled blood in the water. My father groaned in his sleep, shifting on the lumpy mattress. I looked at him, his face gray and gaunt. He had built everything for us. He had worked 18-hour days so I could go to college debt-free, so Mom could have her country club membership. And she was feeding him to the shark. I pulled up the shared family cloud account. It was empty. Of course it was. She had wiped it. But digital deletion is rarely permanent. I navigated to the Restore Previous Versions tab of the main directory. It was grayed out. She, or Julian, had been thorough. They had disabled versioning. Okay, I whispered to the empty room. You want to play hardball? I reached into my bag and pulled out a portable hard drive. 2 years ago, I had digitized all of Dad's business records for the company's 50th anniversary. I had a snapshot of the finances from 24 months ago. It wasn't current, but it was a baseline. If I could compare the asset list from 2 years ago to public property records today, I could see what was missing. I started searching the county clerk's database. 142 Willow Lane rental property, sold 3 weeks ago. T. He Lake House, transfer of deed recorded 5 days ago. Logistics Fleet Warehouse B, listed for expedited sale. My heart hammered. They weren't just skimming off the top. They were liquidating the entire portfolio. They were turning brick and mortar into cash, cash that could be moved offshore, cash that could disappear. I looked up Julian Blackwood. No LinkedIn, no firm website, just a generic landing page with a phone number. I dug deeper, using a LexisNexis login I had for work. Julian Blackwood didn't exist before 3 years ago. But a man named Julian Vane did. And Julian Vane had 2 indictments for elder fraud and embezzlement in Florida, both dismissed due to lack of evidence and witness recantation. You didn't check his background, Mom, I whispered, staring at the mugshot on my screen. It was younger, less polished, but the eyes were the same. Cold, predatory. Or maybe you did, and that's exactly why you hired him. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a sickly gray light through the motel curtains. My phone buzzed again. Mom, Clara, I'm calling the police. You've kidnapped him. You're having a breakdown. Tell me where you are and we can fix this. Julian can help us. I stared at the message. She was bringing the hammer down. She was going to paint me as the unstable daughter, the one who cracked under the pressure of her father's illness. She would use the police to drag us back, and once we were back behind those walls, Dad would never wake up again. I looked at my father, sleeping the sleep of the drugged. I typed a reply, my fingers trembling with rage. I know who Julian Vane is. I hit send. Then I turned off my phone, pulled the SIM card out, and snapped it in half. The game had changed. I wasn't just running anymore. I was hunting. Snapping the SIM card was a moment of definitive severance, but as the pieces of plastic hit the dirty motel carpet, the silence that followed was deafening. I wasn't just cutting off my mother. I was cutting off our lifeline to the world. We can't stay here, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. If she tracks the phone's last ping, the police will be swarming this place within the hour. She's going to spin this as a kidnapping, Dad. We have to disappear. Dad sat up on the edge of the bed. The color was slowly returning to his face, though his hands still shook with the tremors of withdrawal from whatever cocktail she had been feeding him. The cabin, he rasped. She hates the cabin. She hasn't been there in 15 years. She sold the land around it, but the structure, the deed is in your name. I put it in a trust when you turned 18. She can't touch it. I blinked. The fishing shack on Lake Arrowhead, I thought that fell down years ago. I paid a caretaker, Dad said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. Cash under the table, to keep it standing, just in case. Just in case, the phrase hung in the air. He had known, on some subconscious level, that he might need an escape hatch. We moved fast. I abandoned my car in the motel lot. It was too recognizable, a bright blue hatchback that screamed Clara. We walked 2 miles to a used car lot that was just opening. I used the majority of my emergency cash to buy a beat-up, tan sedan with 200,000 miles on it from a guy who didn't ask for ID, just counted the bills with greasy fingers. The drive to the cabin took 4 hours. We stayed off the highways, winding through back roads where the trees grew thick and the cell service died. When we finally arrived, the cabin was dusty and smelled of pine needles and damp wood, but it was solid. It was safe. Once Dad was settled on the old plaid sofa with a blanket and a bottle of water, I set up my war room on the kitchen table. "Okay," I said, opening my laptop. I didn't connect to the internet yet. I needed to understand the battlefield first. "Dad, tell me about the leverage, the warehouse fire. You said she has proof you were negligent. What kind of proof?" Dad rubbed his face, looking older than I had ever seen him. An email from me to the floor manager, instructing him to bypass the safety checks to speed up a shipment. The fire happened 2 days later. 3 people were injured. If that email comes out, it looks like I ordered the negligence that caused the accident. Insurance fraud, criminal negligence. "And you didn't send it." "I don't remember sending it," he whispered, shame coloring his tone. "But she showed it to me. It came from my account. It had my signature block, and around that time I was drinking a bit. The stress, I thought maybe I had done it in a blackout. She convinced me I had." I narrowed my eyes. "Dad, I'm an archivist. I specialize in authentication. Do you have a copy of this email?" "She keeps a printout in the safe," he said. "But she emailed me a copy for my records when she first brought it up. It might be in the offline Outlook archive on my laptop." I had his laptop bag. I had grabbed it from the study when we fled. I booted up his machine. I found the email in a folder labeled Legal Private. I opened it from thomas.k@logistics.com to mark.s@logistics.com. Date, November 14, 2018. I stared at the text. It looked legitimate, but my job was to look closer than anyone else. I expanded the header information. I looked at the routing data. "Dad," I said slowly, zooming in on the text body. "What font did your company use in 2018? "What?" He looked confused. "I don't know, standard, Times New Roman, Arial." "Your company branding guide," I recited from memory, having organized the anniversary exhibit, mandated the use of Calibri for all internal correspondence until the rebrand in 2020. "This email, the body text is in Arial, but your signature block, that's in Calibri." I leaned closer, my heart pounding. "And look at the timestamp. 14:00 p.m. But the server routing stamp, the digital fingerprint that shows when it actually hit the exchange, says 19:30 UTC. That's a 5-hour difference. In November, with daylight savings, that math doesn't add up for the server location in Chicago." I typed furiously, running a metadata script I used for verifying digital donor records. "This isn't an email," I said, my voice rising with triumph. "It's a composite. She, or someone she hired, took the header from a real email, a signature from another, and pasted fake text in the middle. They converted it to a PDF to flatten the layers so you couldn't click on it, then printed it out. Dad, you never sent this. It's a forgery. A bad one." Dad stared at the screen, his mouth open. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness, but of relief so profound he looked like he might collapse. "I didn't do it." "You didn't do it," I affirmed. "Her leverage is smoke, it's fake." "She held that over me for 3 years," he whispered, his voice hardening into something jagged. "She made me step down as CEO because of this. She took control of the board because I was compromised." "She doesn't have leverage anymore," I said, a cold resolve settling in my chest. "Now we have leverage, because forgery of corporate documents to seize control of a company, that's a federal crime, and we're going to prove she did it." I finally connected the laptop to the slow satellite internet of the cabin. Now, let's find out where the money is going. I needed to rattle her. I needed her to make a mistake. I waited until 7:00 p.m. The sun was setting over the lake, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. I set up my phone to record the call. I used a VoIP app to scramble the number, routing it through a server in Canada. I sat at the kitchen table, Dad across from me. He gave me a nod. He looked stronger now, the knowledge of his innocence acting like a better medicine than anything a doctor could prescribe. I dialed her number. It rang once. Clara, her voice was shrill, breathless. Oh, thank God. Clara, where are you? The police are here. They're issuing an Amber Alert for a vulnerable adult. You have to bring him home. He needs his infusion. Cut the act, Mom, I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly so. I know about the pills. I know he's not sick. I know you've been sedating him. There was a pause, a heavy, loaded silence. When she spoke again, the frantic mother tone was gone, replaced by the steel I recognized from my childhood. You don't know what you're talking about, Clara. You're an assistant at a museum. You don't understand medicine. I understand forgery, I countered. I looked at the email, Mom, the one about the warehouse fire. You messed up the metadata. You used the wrong font for the body text. It's a fake. And I have the original server logs from the backup drives to prove it. I heard a sharp intake of breath. And I continued, pressing the advantage. I know about Julian Vane. I know about his indictments in Florida. I know he's not a financial planner. He's a con artist you brought in to strip the company. You listen to me, a male voice cut in. It was Julian. He must have been listening on speakerphone. His smooth, corporate voice was gone, replaced by a thug's growl. You're out of your depth, little girl. We have power of attorney. We have the medical directives. If you don't bring him back, we will have you arrested for kidnapping and elder abuse. You'll never work in a museum again. You'll be in a cell. Let me speak to my wife, Dad said. I turned the phone toward him. Evelyn, Dad said. His voice was rough but clear. Thomas, she sounded shaken. Thomas, honey, tell her to bring you home. You're confused. I'm not confused, Evelyn. I'm awake, for the first time in months. Dad's hands were clenched into fists on the table. How could you, after 30 years, how could you try to erase me? I did what I had to do, she snapped, her composure cracking. You were running the company into the ground with your ethics and your char. Heidi, we were bleeding cash, Thomas. I saved us. Julian and I are securing the future. By stealing it, I interjected. I see the transfers, Mom. You're not securing anything. You're liquidating. You're cashing out. You're planning to run. We are doing what is necessary, she screamed. And you are ruining it. You ungrateful, selfish child. I gave you everything. The private schools, the lessons, the debt-free life. And this is how you repay me, by stealing my husband and hiding in the woods. I'm not hiding, I said, my thumb hovering over the end call button. I'm building a case. And Mom, Julian isn't going to take you with him. Look up his record. In the Florida case, he left his partner holding the bag. He's going to leave you to rot in prison while he spends Dad's money in the Caymans. Shut up, Julian roared. Track the trace, find them. I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Dad. He was weeping silently, tears tracking through the stubble on his cheeks. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the heartbreak of a man realizing the woman he loved had been dead for a long time, replaced by this monster. She admitted it, Dad whispered. She admitted she did it. She did, I said, saving the recording and immediately uploading it to 3 different cloud servers. But admissions on a phone call aren't enough to stop the bank transfers. We need to stop the money. I looked at the notes I had made from the hacked ledger. The final transfer, the liquidation of the primary holding company. It's scheduled for tomorrow at noon. It requires a physical key fob authorization because of the amount. It's a fail-safe Dad installed. The fob, Dad said, patting his pockets. I don't have it. It was in the safe at the house. No, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. It wasn't. Mom thought it was in the safe. But remember, you lost the primary fob 3 years ago. You had a replacement made. Right. But you didn't lose the primary one, I said. You left it in your old office at the rail yard. In the time capsule box we buried in the floorboards during the renovation. I archived it. I wrote it down in the inventory log. Dad's eyes went wide. It's still there. If Mom didn't know to look for it, it's still there. And if we get that fob, we can override the system. We can freeze the accounts from the inside before she can authenticate the transfer. But the rail yard, Dad hesitated. That's near the house, it's risky. It's the only way, I said. We have to go back. The drive back toward the city felt like a descent into hell. We left the cabin at 3:00 a.m., hoping to reach the rail yard before dawn. The darkness seemed thicker, more menacing. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror made me flinch. I checked the news on my burner phone. It was bad. Missing endangered adult. Police are searching for Thomas K., 62, believed to have been abducted by his daughter. Clara K. suspect is considered unstable. They had played the card. My face was on the local news. A grainy photo from my staff ID at the museum. They really did it, I muttered. I'm a fugitive. Keep driving, Dad said, his eyes fixed on the road. We just need the fob. While I drove, I had Dad dictating everything he could remember about the last few months. Every pill, every weird conversation, every document she made him sign. I was building a timeline. The doctor, Dad said suddenly. Dr. Eris, he was the one who prescribed the sedatives. He came to the house. I looked him up, I said, keeping my eyes on the road. Dr. Eris had his medical license suspended in 2019 for overprescribing opioids. He's not practicing legally. Mom must be paying him cash. That's another felony. Conspiracy. We reached the old rail yard at 5:30 a.m. The sky was turning a bruised purple. The facility was a skeletal remains of what it used to be: rusted tracks, empty warehouses, and the small brick administrative building where Dad had started the company. I parked the car behind a stack of rotting shipping containers. Stay here, I told Dad. If you see police, honk the horn. If you see Mom's car, run. Clara, I'll be fast. I grabbed my crowbar from the trunk. I ran to the back of the brick building. The windows were boarded up. I pried a loose board off the bathroom window, the wood screaming as the nails gave way. I squeezed through, dropping into the musty darkness. The air smelled of mold and dead rats. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust. I navigated to Dad's old office. The floorboards were warped. I found the loose panel under where the desk used to be. I jammed the crowbar in and heaved. It splintered open. There, nestled in a metal cash box covered in dust, was the time capsule. I opened it. Photos, a newspaper from 1990, and the gray plastic security fob. I grabbed it, I pressed the button. A green light flashed. Bat. Rye still good. I turned to leave, triumph surging through me. Then I heard it, tires crunching on gravel outside. I froze, I killed the flashlight. I crept to the window and peered through the crack in the boards. It wasn't the police. It was a black SUV, a Mercedes, my mother's car. My stomach dropped. How did she know? Then I remembered, the car I bought, the cheap sedan. I hadn't checked it for a GPS tracker, but surely, no, then I realized. The fob. The moment I pressed the button to check the battery, it pinged the server. The server that Julian was monitoring. I had just lit a flare on a digital map telling them exactly where I was. Damn it, I hissed. I saw Julian step out of the car. He was holding a tire iron. Mom stepped out the other side. She looked impeccable, even at dawn. She was wearing a trench coat. She looked like she was going to church, not to corner her daughter in an abandoned rail yard. Clara, Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the metal containers. We know you're in there. Come out. We just want the fob. I looked back at the car where Dad was hiding. He was slumped down, invisible. They hadn't seen him yet. I had the fob, I had the leverage, but I was trapped. I pulled out my phone. I had one card left to play. I didn't call the police. Julian would spin it before they even arrived. I called the one person who terrified Julian more than the cops. I called the number I had found in the archives of the Florida court case. The lawyer representing the victims of his last scam. The one who had sworn to nail him if he ever surfaced again. "Hello," a groggy voice answered. "Mr. Henderson?" I whispered. "My name is Clara. I'm currently staring at Julian Vane. He's about to wire $10 million of stolen funds, and I can give you the IP address, the bank codes, and his location right now." The voice on the other end woke up instantly. "I'm listening." "I need you to call the FBI," I said, watching Julian smash the lock on the front door of the building. "And tell them there is an active hostage situation at the rail yard. And tell them to bring the fraud division." "Done," Henderson said. "Hold tight, kid." I hung up. The front door crashed open. I backed into the shadows of the office, clutching the fob like a grenade. "Come out, Clara." Mom's voice drifted down the hall, sweet and poisonous. "Don't make this difficult. We're family." I stepped into the light of the hallway, holding the fob high. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice echoing in the empty building. "We are family, and that's exactly why I'm going to be the one to end this." Julian rounded the corner, the tire iron raised. He stopped when he saw me. He grinned. "Give it here," he sneered. "One step closer," I said, my thumb hovering over the deny lock button on the fob, and I lock the entire system. "Permanently. You won't get a dime. You'll just get a prison sentence." Julian hesitated. He looked at Mom. "She's bluffing," Mom said, though she looked pale. "She doesn't know how to use it." "I'm an archivist," I said, staring her dead in the eye. "I know how to close a file." I pressed the button. The single, high-pitched beep of the fob seemed to echo in the dusty hallway for an eternity. I didn't just press the button. I held it down, engaging the emergency security lockdown protocol my father had designed for catastrophic data breaches. Julian scrambled for his phone, his composure shattering. He tapped furiously at the screen, his face draining of blood until he looked like a wax figure melting under the heat of his own panic. "What did you do?" he whispered, staring at his screen. Then he screamed, a raw, animalistic sound that made me flinch. "Access DNIED, administrator lockout, you little witch." He threw his phone against the brick wall. It shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. "It's over, Julian," I said, my voice trembling but loud. "The accounts are frozen. The board has been notified automatically." The moment I pressed that, an alert went to the SEC and the bank's fraud division. "You can't move the money. You can't even log in." Julian turned slowly to look at me, his eyes wide and manic. He gripped the tire iron tighter, his knuckles white. The veneer of the corporate consultant was gone completely now. There was only violence left. "You ruined it," he hissed, taking a step toward me. $10 million. You ruined everything." "Julian," Mom stepped forward, grabbing his arm. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between him and me. "Julian, stop. We can fix this. We can tell them she stole the fob. We can." He shoved her. It wasn't a gentle push. He slammed his forearm into her chest, sending her stumbling back against the rotting doorframe. She gasped, shock painting her features as she slid to the floor, her trench coat gathering dust. "Shut up, you useless old woman," Julian roared at her. "There is no fixing this. He trail is burned. The money is locked. You said she was just a librarian. You said she was stupid." Mom stammered, looking up at him, her hand clutching her chest. For the first time, I saw the realization hit her. She wasn't his partner. She was his mark. "Julian, I did this for us." "There is no us," he spat, turning back to me, raising the iron. "There's just me, and I'm not going back to prison because of some meddling girl." He lunged. I scrambled backward, tripping over a pile of debris, bracing for the blow. But it never came. A loud, piercing horn blasted through the building, shaking the dust from the rafters. The bay door at the end of the warehouse, the one I had thought was rusted shut, shuddered violently. Crash! The front of the beige sedan, my getaway car, smashed through the rotted wood of the bay door, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The car groaned as it lurched into the hallway, blocking Julian's path to me. The driver's door flew open. My father stumbled out. He wasn't the frail invalid in the wheelchair anymore. He was running on pure adrenaline and rage. He held a heavy flashlight in his hand, looking like a vengeful ghost. "Get away from her," Dad bellowed. His voice cracked, but it carried the weight of 30 years of authority. Julian spun around, startled. "Thomas." "I heard you," Dad said, stepping between me and the man who had tried to steal his life. He was breathing hard, swaying slightly, but he stood his ground. "I heard everything. You called her useless. You admitted it." Julian laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. "Look at you. You can barely stand. You think you can stop me." He raised the tire iron again, advancing on my father. "No," I screamed, scrambling to my feet. But then, the sound of the world outside changed. The quiet morning air was suddenly torn apart by the wail of sirens. Not one, but a chorus of them. Blue and red lights began to flash through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, turning the dusty warehouse into a strobe-lit nightmare. "This is the FBI," a voice boomed over a megaphone from outside. "We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Julian froze. The tire iron wavered in his hand. He looked at the door, then at the back window, then at us. The realization that there was no escape washed over him. He dropped the iron. It clanged loudly on the concrete. "It was her," Julian shouted toward the door, his hands flying up in surrender. "It was Evelyn. She masterminded the whole thing. She forced me." Mom let out a wail from the floor, a sound of pure devastation. "You liar, you said you loved me." The front doors were kicked in. Heavily armed agents in tactical gear swarmed the hallway, their rifles raised. "Get on the ground now." I watched as they tackled Julian. He didn't fight, he just kept screaming accusations at my mother. They zip-tied his hands behind his back and hauled him up. Then 2 officers approached Mom. She was still sitting in the dust, weeping, her elegant trench coat ruined. "Evelyn K," an officer asked. I'm the victim here," she sobbed, trying to stand up, attempting to regain some shred of her dignity. She smoothed her hair, looking frantically at the officers. "He tricked me. I didn't know. My husband. I was trying to protect him." She looked at Dad, her eyes pleading. "Thomas, tell them I was protecting you." Dad stood there, leaning heavily against the hood of the car for support. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 3 decades. He looked at the woman who had poisoned him, lied to him, and tried to frame him for arson. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just looked at her with a profound, crushing pity. "You weren't protecting me, Evelyn," he said softly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You were erasing me." He turned his back on her. "Thomas," she screamed as the officer cuffed her. "Thomas, don't you turn away from me. I did this for the family. I did this for the status. Don't you dare let them take me." The police let her out. I followed, supporting Dad. As we stepped out of the dark warehouse into the blinding morning sun, the public nature of her downfall became complete. Because of the Amber Alert, the press had been monitoring the police scanners. 3 news vans were parked at the perimeter. Cameras were rolling. My mother, the head of the charity guild, the woman who prided herself on appearance above all else, was marched out in handcuffs, covered in dust, screaming like a banshee, while the cameras broadcasted her unraveling to the entire city. She looked at the cameras, then she looked at me. "Clara," she shouted, trying to lunge toward the microphones. "My daughter is unstable. She planned this. She's the villain." I stopped. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera. I didn't hide. I stood tall next to my father. I put my arm around him, and he rested his head on my shoulder. We presented a united front of survival. The image of her desperate, lying face and our silent, dignified resilience was captured live. The court of public opinion had just reached a verdict before the trial even began. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was decided on the first day. My digital excavation of the family finances was thorough. I provided the district attorney with everything: the forged emails, the doctored medical logs we found in Julian's cloud account, which I cracked 2 days after the arrest, and the metadata proving the asset transfers were fraudulent. Julian Vane turned on Mom immediately. He took a plea deal to testify against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. He painted her as the mastermind, the disgruntled wife who sought him out to liquidate the estate before her husband died. Mom tried to fight it. She hired a high-priced defense team using the last of her personal savings. She took the stand, weeping, claiming she was a confused old woman manipulated by a young, handsome lover. But the jury didn't buy it. They didn't buy it because of the recording I had made in the cabin, the recording where she admitted to the forgery, the recording where she screamed that Dad was ruining it. When the recording was played in the courtroom, Mom didn't cry. She went stone cold. She stared at me from the defense table with eyes that were black voids. In that moment, I realized she didn't mourn the loss of her family, she mourned the loss of the game. She was sentenced to 15 years for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Julian got 10. 3 months after the verdict, I was back at the family home. It was different now. We had hired a cleaning crew to scrub the place top to bottom, removing the smell of lavender and illness. We had opened all the curtains. The sunlight streamed in, hitting the dust motes dancing in the air. I was in the study, Dad's real office, not the hospital room it had become. I was packing up the last of the medical equipment to be donated. Clara. I turned. Dad was standing in the doorway. He was using a cane, and he was still thin, but the gray pallor was gone. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt, and his eyes were sharp. He looked like himself again. "Hey, Dad," I smiled, "just finishing up." He walked over and sat in his leather chair. He ran a hand over the mahogany desk. "I'm thinking of selling the house." I paused. "Really?" "Too many ghosts," he said softly. "And it's too big for just me. I was thinking, maybe a condo in the city, near the museum, so I can come visit you for lunch." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'd like that. I'd really like that." "I have a meeting with the board tomorrow," he continued, a spark of his old ambition returning. "We're rebranding. I'm stepping back as CEO, but I'm staying on as chairman. I want to set up a new foundation for elder fraud awareness. I want to use what happened to us to help others." He looked at me, his eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done this without you, Clara. I would have died in this room thinking I was crazy. You saved my life. You saved my soul." I walked over and hugged him. He smelled like Old Spice and coffee, the smell of my childhood, the smell of safety. "You raised me to look for the truth, Dad," I whispered. "I just did my job." He pulled back and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the gray security fob. "I want you to keep this," he said, pressing it into my hand. "Not for the company, but as a reminder. You are the keeper of this family's history, Clara. You're the one who protects the legacy." I closed my fingers around the cool plastic. "I will," I promised. We walked out of the house together, leaving the door unlocked for the real estate agent. We got into his car. He was driving again and headed toward the city. I looked out the window as the suburbs rolled by. I thought about my mother, sitting in a cell, probably organizing her toiletries in perfect, controlling rows. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was distant, like reading a tragedy in a history book. She had tried to write us out of existence. She had tried to delete us. But she forgot the first rule of archival science: nothing is ever truly gone. There is always a trace. And if you look hard enough, the truth will always survive the fire.